This lecture is part one of two lectures that we will have this week on in an introduction to the course. So, in this first part, I'll be talking about a theory of thinking about technology as a form of life that was developed by philosopher Langdon Winter. And rather than have you read his fairly dense, fairly dense text, I have a couple of blog posts that summarize different key aspects of that text, and then my lecture today will go over other key aspects of that. And I have a reading guide for you as well if you want to delve deeper into the concepts. And I can also link the scanned copy of the book, or you can find it in the library. So, Langdon Winter is a noted technological philosopher, has written much about the different ways that technology and society interact, about the ways technology is shaping the world, etc. Here are three of his more well known books. And the chapter that we are reading today, or the chapter that we're going over today, is a chapter that is in The Whale and the Reactor. So it's a chapter, one of the book chapters within this larger volume. And Langdon Winter is really known for his philosophical view that we should think of technological artifacts as having politics, as having a form of power and a form of placement in our society that affords them more than mere tools provides, right? And so, in that sense, we can say like every technological object that we interact with on a daily basis, it is embedded with certain political, social, cultural aspects, right? And it embodies those. And that's really articulated in what is known as artifact theory. So that really says that certain technologies are inherently political, both with their design of the object themselves or in the arrangement of how that design shapes our behavior and social order. And so the key aspect of artifact theory, and that you should take away, is that technology is not neutral, right? Technology is designed, built, marketed, um, like culturally adopted, right? And is enacted in our daily behaviors throughout time and space. Um, Winter is a critic of the idea of technological determinism. So, technological determinism is this idea that technology is expanding kind of without the technology is going to expand no matter what, right? And that humans need to adapt to it. And the critique says no, humans actually have this whole series of choices and this whole social structure that is built around technological development. So it's not like a technological determinist would say technology is increasing at this linear rate and society adapts around it. And instead, the critique of that, and with the framework that we're using for this class, emphasizes that it's actually humans that have these series of choices and reactions to technology that shapes the way that's embedded within our society, that shapes the way that we interact with it, that shapes the way that these technological artifacts that we interact with, how they change our behavior and change the fabric of society. Um, and Langdon Winter's influence has been highly significant in fields of science and technology studies, environmental ethics, contemporary political theory, etc. So definitely a prominent and noted philosopher and scholar about the relationship between technology and human. I'll go over some of his key points in this upcoming lecture, and definitely somebody that I would suggest investigating further if these are topics that you're interested in. So the central thesis of this chapter, which is called Technologies as Forms of Life, is that we must critically examine the nature and the significance of all these artificial aids to human activity that we've developed, employed, and adapted as part of our daily routines. And he asks the question, why is a culture so firmly based upon countless sophisticated instruments, techniques, and systems remains steadfast in its reluctance to examine its own foundation? Right? And so we take technology as a given, as a inherent fact of contemporary life, and he argues that we really need to think about where these things come from and think about how these things that we interact with are interacting and changing our world. And so a good way to kind of frame this is to look at ideas of technological progress within the 20th century, and how technology and this uh, change in the way that we did things and the way we moved through space and time and the way we lived really kind of embedded this technological exceptionalism within our society that thinks of technology as only good, right? And there's a lot of good that comes from that, obviously. Um, but through that modernization and framing of technology is driving society forward towards a higher plane, right, or towards a more uh, exceptional human experience, as technology is an aid to a higher level of the human experience, then we become embedded with these artifacts as given aspects of our daily life. So some of the different things that happened in the 20th century, there's a rapid technological advancement, unprecedented growth in technology, including developments of transportation systems, telecommunication systems, computer systems, etc. There was the rise of industrialization and the rise of mass production. There was significant medical innovations which increased lifespan significantly. And there was a shift in labor markets in the 20th century where there was increasingly more automation, increasingly more technology in the manufacturing of products, and then new sets of skills need to become developed for workers, for laborers to create products. So we think at, historically, if we think about the first assembly line, the Fordist model of production, where we have a line of products, and each human is in charge of assembling a particular part of that instrument or that artifact. And we can think about how that's changed throughout the course of the 20th century. We think back to when Ford was developing this car. This was like the 1906, somewhere along those lines. And we think about a contemporary factory that produces shoes, in this case, right? It's a fully automated process. There's very little human labor involved, but there's human maintenance of the machines that are doing the labor, right? We can also think of that shift in labor as being someone who creates specialized or custom products, right? So like a cobbler, somebody who makes shoes in this case, is creating, before the rise of mass production, a shoemaker would measure someone's feet and make shoes for that person, right? And that pair of shoes would be designed to last a long time, to be of high craftsmanship, to be personalized to the individual, right? We changed that production model to say, oh, we're actually making a bunch of uniform products, right? We make a bunch of uniform products very efficiently, and then humans instead adapt to those products. So that's another shift in the technological production of things, right? So we not only have the transformation of craftsman to assembly line technician, we also have the change of the product itself from customized and individualized to mass produced, and the consumer adapts to the product. And so that really, goes into the two different key aspects of our human relationship to these technical things. There's the making of products, or the making of things, and then there's the use of those things. Right, and so we can think about it as, how do things work? Right, how does a phone work? How does a GPS unit work? Right, this is really the domain of the inventors, the technicians, the engineers, the people that design, build, and maintain these different artifacts, these different technologies that we interact with. And because of that, the production and the maintenance of these things is a complex field that requires expertise, right? Whereas in the past, things didn't require necessarily like mechanical expertise, but they required artistic craftsmanship, right? To make like a pair of shoes or to make clothing required craftsmanship and art, right? And technique. Whereas now, the design of how a machine that can make shoes requires robotics and engineering and technical expertise. So there's a shift in like what we have to know to make things work. And then there's a shift in the way we use things, right? We interact with these products in various ways. Oftentimes we interact with a phone for a particular purpose, and these technological artifacts, they come into being, right? They become known to our consciousness as we use them. They kind of fade back into the background when we don't use them. So there's something that interacts with us all the time, and we interact with them um, in a different form of pattern. So there's an asymmetrical interface that happens between the artifact itself and us using it. We'll get more of that throughout the course of the semester. And here's a quote from this chapter. Technologies are not merely aids to human activity, but are also powerful forces acting to reshape that activity and meaning. So automation in an industrial workplace not only increases productivity, but it also changes the process of production and redefines what work means in that setting. Right, so the automation, the digital transformation of the labor economy from craftsmen to mass production, right, not only changed the scale of productivity within the marketplace, but also changed the process of production, and it redefined what labor means. So when we think about technology, one of the things we should always think about, right, is what does technology offer and what does it limit? Right, so all things that we interface with on a daily basis offer us something. They open up a certain world to us, but they also close off another world to us. A very easy example of this is the idea of the automobile and traveling via automobile. Right, we're able to cover vast amounts of space in increased times. Right, so our relationship of space-time is altered completely because our capability of moving from point A to point B within a certain time window is drastically changed as opposed to walking or biking or a non-motorized form of transportation. Right, so we're able to increase our amount of space that we're able to cover in a set amount of time. But because of that, what does that limit? What does that limit in terms of our perceptions of how we socially interact with our surroundings, about how we interact with other people, about how we see and view and sense the world, right? When you're walking or when you're biking, that affords a certain set of senses for you to interact with. Sights, sounds, smells, textures, right? When you're driving, that's a very kind of isolated, you're interacting with kind of a small space of your individual surroundings of your car, and then that is interfacing with the road and the other traffic. So it changes that relationship of how we interact with the world, being in a car versus walking, obviously, and it also changes our space-time understanding. So it offers all technologies that we have. They offer us something, they provide something, but there's also a limitation or unintended consequence of what that technology does to our daily routines or sense of self or whatever. And so this is a key quote that I like from the article as well. Knowing how an automobile is made, how they operate, how they're used, knowing about things like transportation laws, transportation policy, right? That sets the parameters of how a technology is used, but that doesn't allow us to really understand how that automobile affects the textures of our daily life. So really kind of keep that in mind as you go through the semester, right? That there's the making of a product, right? The rules that are set around that, the societal expectations, the design, the manufacturing, the distribution, the all those things that go into like taking a conceptual idea of a technology and implementing it and producing it and having that being something that's distributed and widely used by people, right? There's a set of processes and things to think about in that capacity that are super interesting. And there's also this idea of what does it mean to use a product? What does it mean to use a technology, right? What does that afford? What does that limit? What are the small scale, like the daily implications of that? Your daily, how does that change your individual and daily life? Then there's the broader societal, environmental, cultural implications of that. We touched on this briefly, but just to go over it again, technological determinism is really the idea that technological innovation is the basic cause and change in society, and that human beings have little choice but to kind of sit back and watch this linear process unfold. So that's like it's a very kind of like uh, futuristic, kind of utopian conception of what technology does, right? That it moves forward and we adapt and change around it. People that like Winter, like Langdon Winter, uh, who are proponents of the critique of this idea, this critique of technological determinism, say instead that we have the capability of opting in various ways, individually and collectively, that we make choices, and that we don't really think about those choices as until they're already kind of in the rearview mirror, if that makes sense. So it's like we have all these points of interaction, all these points of potentiality to make these significant uh, to make these significant points of contact, kind of with the flow of technological change. But oftentimes we just kind of sit back and let that unfold, and that confuses determinism with what uh, Langdon Winter calls technological somnambulism, right? So determinism, it's happening, and we're just along for the ride. Uh, Somnambulism says these outcomes are not fixed, but we willingly sleepwalk. We kind of let them happen because we collectively have political constraints that kind of limit the power of the individual. We make consumer choices for convenience. We do all these various things, right? Um, that allow this kind of technological process to unfold, and we just kind of adapt to it without thinking about the consequences of that process. We'll talk a lot more about this when we talk about AI, when um, we talk about geoengineering, things like that later in the semester. And then a couple other things we've seen. I'm sure that you've seen this graph before. This is what called Moore's law, and this is really the idea that the number of transistors on microchips doubles every 2 years. And basically, what that means is that our technological capability of storing data, of transmitting information, of uh, of networks, connectivities, all those things, they basically double every 2 years. So our technological process doubles every 2 years. And we all often see this chart that says, oh, here we were in 1970, and you know the transistor count on microchips doubles every 2 years, right? So by the time we get to 2020, we're way up here at this enormous amount where we started in 1970 down here at 1,000. Now we're at 10 billion or 50 billion or whatever, right? And so we often think about that like we're like, oh, okay, there's like this linear progression of technology. But in reality, what we're looking at in terms of our technological progression, if we think about how things double every year, is not this linear growth, this red line, but rather it's this green exponential growth, right? So this is the technological curve that we're actually on, is this green one, right? And where we are within that process is up for debate. You could say, oh, we're here. Things have been advancing rapidly for the, doubling every 2 years, and we're up here at this point. Or you can make the argument like, oh, we're actually like way down here, and the things that have changed thus far are just, you know, the beginning of this kind of rapid change that's about to happen. There's not really any way of knowing that until until you're at the tail end of knowing what the process was, where we are along that process now, right? But that's something to keep in mind, is that we often see this kind of we often have this conception of technological progress as linear, and we should really be thinking of it as exponential. And where we are within that exponential growth, we are uncertain of it this time. Um, but we do know that it is changing how we interact with the world, how our daily lives are shaped by various things, the environmental, economic implications of those are starting to be unveiled. So there's a lot of like complicated entanglements that will kind of start to peel apart a little bit in this class when we start to think about how these technologies change the fabric of our world. Um, but yeah, I think a good thing to keep in mind is that that process is not linear. That process is exponential, and where we are on that curve, we don't know. That's it for this kind of brief part of the lecture. There's 2 readings that go along with this, followed by a quiz, and then you have an assignment of which I will introduce in video lecture 2.